I'll be reading from Matthew 19, 3 through 6. Matthew 19, 3 through 6. The Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And he answered and said unto them, Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more two, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let no man put asunder.
Good morning. I know y'all look excited. Y'all really do this morning. I always ask you if you're excited, but I can tell everybody's heads roll back a little, yawning. I got up here, and when I sat down there, I looked at this quick scan. It was like 17 people with their mouth wide open this morning. It's amazing to lose 1 hour, right? What that can do for us, and I understand that happens sometimes. But before we get started this morning, I had a couple other things that I wanted to make mention of. We mentioned Wednesday night, Cason Hickenbottom. He will be going into the hospital actually tomorrow, or this afternoon, or tomorrow in the morning. I think maybe it's today. They'll be starting some stuff tomorrow. He's 8 years old, from Belmont. That's Chris and Ashley's son. He's going to be having a kidney transplant. Ashley will be the donor of that, and her surgery will be tomorrow in Memphis at Methodist at 7:30, or actually March the 11th, so that'll be Tuesday. Her surgery, it said, could last around 3 hours. Cason will be receiving the transplant at La Bonheur. So he'll be in Memphis there. His surgery is about 6 hours. So keep that in mind for that family, because they're going to be split up there between two hospitals. So ask that, pray for that family over the next couple of days as well. I got another text this week. This was from Wren Russell. She's been selected to do a marketing internship, basically, and this is going to be abroad. She's going to Dublin, Ireland, and she's going to London, England, and she's really, really excited about this opportunity, but also at the same time, she's really, really nervous about this opportunity as well, as are Allison and also Becky as well. And she asked if the church family here would continue to remember her and pray for her. So just remember those two, that family, and then Wren as well. She said she appreciated your prayers here, loved everyone here, and just really wanted you to know she appreciated all that had been done for her through the years. So continue to remember her. If you hadn't already, turn your Bibles, Matthew chapter 19. Be looking this morning at this text here. We've reached a turning point here in the gospel again with Matthew. The first verse of chapter 19 here tells us Jesus is leaving Galilee. And Galilee was kind of a place of retreat for Jesus. It was a place where he could escape. He could escape some of his enemies. It was a place, I think, where he could get some rest and some perspective. But now his Bible tells us he's going on to Judea. And it's believed here at this time he's only about 5 months away from the crucifixion. So Luke's account of this story also tells us, it proclaims that Jesus has set his face towards Jerusalem. So there's some things coming. This will be his last time here in this region of Judea, and also even going to Jerusalem. But as we read, there's large crowds continually following Jesus. And Jesus continues doing the things that he's done. He's still healing the crowds. But he comes across some of the Pharisees here. And he's approached with a question. And this question was a purpose that was going to test Jesus in verse number 3 there. And if we were to ask this same question in our society today, what would our answer be? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? Think about all the answers that you would get today. Some of the things that I've even seen and looked up this week. I read one to where there was a lady who wanted to divorce her husband because he used a fork to eat corn. There was a lady who wanted to divorce her husband because he had carried their daughter to the circus, and she told him that his daughter could only ride the elephant one time, and he allowed her to ride it twice. So it just goes on and on of all the reasons that we come up with in our society. I even went as far as there's a thing called no-fault divorce. You can get that done for $499. In the state of Mississippi, if you don't need a lawyer, for $149, you can get papers drawn up and do no-fault divorce. I didn't even really know this. I didn't look it up. There's a site that I found on the internet this week, and as I was typing some of this in and doing some research, and I pulled it up, and on their front page of it, proudly displayed over 1 million divorces that they had taken care of. That was their slogan. That was their advertisement for these types of things. So in our world, what would they say? Most people, if you ask, the answer would be for whatever reason. So here, we're going to see that even in Roman first century times, the Jewish society, they struggled with the same thing. They had some of the same issues, some of the same teachers. The Jews were very much divided on the issue with this loaded question that they asked Jesus. And they understood that whichever way Jesus answered this question, there was going to be some people that was not happy. So there were two current opinions among leaders at this time. The school of Hillel, all right? His teaching was divorce from any reason. He is even quoted for saying that if you did not like the tone, now my wife tells me that sometimes, it wasn't what you said, but it was the tone you used. Now, if you didn't like the tone of your wife, if you didn't like the manners of your wife, if you didn't like that she burnt supper, there was any reason. He was quoted for saying and teaching some of these things. So who do you think the people and the crowd had the greatest tendency to want to follow? They're going to go with that school of teaching. Now Shammai believed that divorce only. Both schools of thought was taken from the exact same verse. The school of Hillel in Deuteronomy 24:1 it says this, and they use this, if she find no favor in his eyes, then he may write her a bill of divorcement and give it to her hand and send her out of his house. That was the text that they used for any reason. The school of Shammai in Deuteronomy 24 verse 1, which says, also, because he hath found someone or some unseemly thing in her, which they interpreted as adultery, was the script or the text that they used to draw their conclusion. So this is the two trains of thoughts of these Pharisees that Jesus is approaching here, and they are asking him this question. They're putting him in a difficult situation, so they think. So it's important for us to consider as we begin, we don't get to determine this answer. The Pharisees, though they're testing Jesus, they're asking for that actual authority. They're asking, is it lawful to divorce for any reason? So we need to look to the Lord for authority for what we do in this life. Sometimes we forget that we don't determine what's right and wrong. So we look to Jesus for the answer. So we're going to consider the answers this morning to some of these questions that was asked. Jesus begins in this section with the thought of, have you not read? Most of the time, it's sad to say in our society today, the reason that we go to read is to look for the loophole, to look for a different kind of answer, an answer that will give us authority to do the things we want to do. So Jesus begins here in verse 4, and Jesus seems to indicate that the answer is quite self-evident. He begins, have you not read? Jesus doesn't start this question like I've started this question sometimes. Like, you know, that's a tough problem you've got there. That's a tough, really, really tough thing that we have to talk about sometimes. You know, that's complicated. Jesus doesn't even bat an eye. The answer to him is self-evident. Notice what Jesus does. He goes all the way back to Genesis. And that's his first answer. In Genesis 1:27, in the beginning, God made them male and female. Second, Jesus states or restates where God gives the instructions on marriage in Genesis 2:24. So from this, we have to understand, we don't define marriage. God defines marriage. Our legal system doesn't define marriage. Our government doesn't get to define marriage. It doesn't matter how many politicians or how many senators or how many congressmen vote to say this is what it is. God created marriage, and he gives the definition of that marriage. Notice how he defines it. He said it's a male and a female, leaving their parents, joining together, becoming one flesh. This is the definition of marriage, and there's not a single solitary thing that we can do to change it. We can try. We can make up new words. We can even go into some of the different Wikipedias and different places. We can even add our definition. We can add things in our culture. We can make up new words. We can change, add those definitions. We can add letters and numbers and pluses and minuses and all, but it doesn't matter. God tells us it's by God's authority and God's authority only what marriage is. He says marriage is not more than two people. God says marriage is a born male and a female leaving their family and homes and uniting as one flesh. So in verse 6 there, notice the conclusion that's drawn. They are no longer two people, but they have become one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. So the Pharisees asked, is it lawful to divorce for any reason? What was Jesus' answer? Jesus' answer is no. It's not lawful. Please also notice that Jesus does not state this is something new. Jesus does not say that this is the Mosaic law. It doesn't state that it's Jewish law. Jesus bypasses all of those, both of those things, and he goes back to the very beginning, the beginning of creation and God's marriage. God's marriage was given before Moses' law or Christ's covenant, and it's applicable to all people. So God's marriage law is one man, one woman joined together for life, and he plainly states that where we are not to separate in marriage because God himself has joined us together. We also have to notice that this is where Jesus ends his answer. The other accounts, if you go through the Gospels, in Mark 10, 1 through 9, Luke 16, 18, this is a rule. Marriage is permanent. And God has joined together, so we are not going to separate. Now, if you look closely in verses 7 through 9, there's an exception. There's an exception to the rule that Jesus gives, but you're not obligated to go through with this exception. You're not required. You do not have to. I want you to think this morning as you go through this whole lesson, as we think about this whole lesson. God from the very beginning, Jesus through his ministry, all the lessons, all the things that we've learned that he's trying to teach us, the one thing I think it's important, we can be reconciled. It's important for us to be reconciled with God. Now the Pharisees here at this point, they have this question about what Jesus has taught. When you read verse 7, they say to him, when or why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and put her away? So they didn't like the first answer, so we got the why question. These religious teachers had studied and primarily interpreted Moses' law. to say that you could divorce for any reason, so long as you give her the divorce papers. Now, let's just think just a minute about that interpretation. Do we think that God's major concern about marriage and marriage for each one of us is making sure that you fill out the proper paperwork? Is God's big concern that you could divorce for any reason that you could think of, as long as everyone had a certificate and proving that they had been divorced? This answer, it just doesn't fit what Jesus had said, nor would it fit the marriage law that God had given in Genesis 2. This is why Jesus says in verses 8 and 9, the point of the certificate, it was not to allow the people to divorce for any reason. The problem Jesus notes, and he makes a big note here, and the way he says it, he's talking about those in the past, and he's talking about those that are there in the present as well. It was the hardness of their hearts. Now think about what Jesus is saying about hardness of hearts. Do we see God changing his law because people didn't like it? Is Jesus' point that God's marriage was to not divorce, but since you didn't like that law, God's just going to allow it so long as you've got paperwork? God never budged with his people, even when they were hard-hearted towards him. You see, the problem was that these men, their hearts were hard. And the problem was that they were divorcing their wives in violation of God's law. So God needed to do something at this time to protect these women from these husbands, hard-hearted individuals. So this is what Jesus is revealing to them. What Moses gave was not a license for divorce, but it was to help deal with the sinfulness that was going on among those people and help protect those women. So Jesus then at that point in verse 9, he restates, if you divorce and marry someone else, you're committing adultery. The exception to the law is if the divorce is because of sexual immorality committed by that spouse. In that situation, a person is legally allowed to remarry. In short, the rule is not lawful to divorce for any reason. The exception is that divorce and remarriage can occur only for the reason of sexual immorality being committed. But it is not required. There could still be reconciliation there. If you look at verse 10 in your text, you're going to see that the disciples have a huge response here to what had just been said. Listen to what they say after hearing this. If this is the case, a husband with a wife, it is better to not marry. Now, this response is important for us to think about. How did they understand what Jesus had just taught? Now think about all the lessons that we've done. Learning from Jesus, looking at Jesus, and how many times the disciples had come to Jesus and said, will you explain this to me? Will you tell me what this parable meant? How did they understand? Do you think that what Jesus said was complicated? Did they think what Jesus said was confusing? Not at all. They didn't have any problem understanding what Jesus had said. Rather, what Jesus taught was very straightforward, and they understood it very clearly. The disciples understood that Jesus taught the permanency of marriage, and that there's only one reason. If there were lots of reasons, then the disciples would not have remarked that it is better to not marry. Marriage is permanent. So we do not get divorced because we fall out of love. All the reasons that's given, I look and there was literally hundreds of thousands of different reasons that people give. He's trying to get us to recognize the importance of our chosen spouse. He's trying to get us to recognize how important it is for us to be in that proper relationship. If what Jesus said right here in this text was just easy for anybody, then you have to know the disciples then definitely wouldn't have said or asked the question that they asked. Jesus was teaching here about a lifelong commitment. Notice what Jesus' response was to the disciples. If you look at verse 11, after they'd said, then it is better to not marry, Jesus doesn't grab those guys and say, hey, you're overreacting. Calm down, guys. He doesn't say that. He doesn't tell them that, you've misunderstood what I'm teaching. Jesus doesn't give that option. But he notes that not everyone will make the decision not to be able to marry. But we have to look at the seriousness of marriage and decide, sometimes it may be, it is better to not marry. You can do that. But Jesus also notes that not everyone can decide to live alone or will want to be married. How Jesus ends this discussion in verse 12 is also instructive. For there are eunuchs who are born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it. Jesus uses this illustration here with the eunuchs. And he's speaking about what he's saying here is, in ancient times, eunuchs were men who were castrated, typically as in service of the royal court. But there are also some who are born with birth defects and without the sexual capabilities or capacities. And then there are some who have been made eunuchs by others. He says there are those who live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So what we have to see from this picture is that it is possible that we can live without being married for the sake of the kingdom. When Jesus says apply to what he said earlier and to what the disciples said it's better to not marry due to the seriousness of God's marriage law. Jesus says that some people will do that for the sake of the kingdom. So we have to consider that Jesus also said that if you divorce and marry another, you're committing adultery. So you will have to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Jesus speaks to this reality. People may need to remain unmarried for one reason or another, and it may be for the sake of the kingdom. Jesus doesn't say this is some ridiculous idea for someone to have to live this way, but Jesus says that living a single life may be your calling in God's kingdom. We have to note that in our world today, it can be so very difficult to apply these principles, to apply actually Jesus' teaching. And I've said this quite often, and I say it in our high school class quite often. It's not Jesus. It's not Jesus' teaching that's complicated. Most of the time, it's us as individuals. We complicate things. We complicate things because we're not willing to follow the instructions that we've been given. Jesus' law on marriage was first, marriage was between a male and a female. Right now, in our society today, challenged on every angle. The world even confuses this teaching sometimes. And not only confuses it, but people are actively fighting against it. Of the thousands, of hundreds of thousands, of millions of dollars that's promoted to fight against this very definition. And you can spend all the money that you want to spend. But God proclaimed what marriage is. And we cannot change it. Second, marriage is permanent. The Pharisees asked if we can divorce for any reason. Jesus just, no. Divorce is not God's will. Divorce is not from the beginning. What God has joined together, we are not separating. We're joined by God. Thirdly, there is only one exception for divorce. And as I've already mentioned, and it's also not required that we do that, but there is an exception. Too many people today tend to approach the Scriptures trying to find the loophole to get out of marriages. We're looking for that option. God doesn't want you out of your marriage. I don't believe God wants anyone out of their marriage. God doesn't want you to look for a loophole. God wants each one of us to look to save our marriages. I think He wants us to look to fix our marriages. Anyone in this room that's been married for any length of time whatsoever knows that there's difficulties there. And it takes work and it takes effort. Each one of us can look for opportunities that maybe we can look to improve our marriage situation. We're never too young, we're never too old. The marriage can only be broken to that one example given by Jesus due to that sexual immorality. But I ask you today, look to reconcile. Why is it that we don't teach that? Why is it that we don't encourage that? Sometimes we have the desirable or necessary to remain unmarried due to God's marriage law. The Apostle Paul made reference to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 through 11. He said, "To the married I give this charge, not I," he said, "but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife." Each one of us must have a high view of marriage. Jesus taught that marriage is serious and marriage is permanent. These are the things that we have to teach on a regular basis to our young people, to our teenagers, to even younger. They have to understand the seriousness of God's, not only His marriage laws, but God's laws. To the point that we don't follow our desires in whatever the situation may be, our wishes that come, so that each one of us can belong in the kingdom of heaven and be true followers of Jesus that we've studied all the way through Matthew. What does it take to be a follower? You're going to have to give up some things. Jesus has taught this on multiple occasions. Every single one of us is called to make various sacrifices for the kingdom. Our relationship with God is one of understanding the seriousness of being a Christian. Understanding that God wants us to be permanent Christians. He doesn't want us to be part-time Christians. And He wants us to live by the laws. This morning, I know this lesson, this topic, but this is still an opportunity for an invitation. I think Jesus wants us to look at ourselves. He wants us to look to save ourselves. He wants us to look to fix ourselves. He wants us to look to improve ourselves. And what would be a better way to spend your Sunday afternoon being reconciled with God the Father? Knowing that you have put yourself back in a place to where whatever the situation that arises that ever happened, it would put yourself in home, in heaven, with God the Father. This is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to have a prayer on your behalf if something is amiss and maybe you've not treated things according to God's law in a specific manner, in the way that He would want you to be. This is an opportunity to pray to fix that. If you're here this morning, you've not yet become a Christian, everything's ready. We'd love to assist you. We'd love to help you. This morning, sometimes we just need to understand the seriousness of our relationship with God. If all is well with you, sing out. Encourage someone else. If not, all we ask you do is respond as we stand and sing.